Hello, everybody, and welcome to our session. My name is Hildegard Theobald. I am professor for organizational gerontology at the University of Fechter. My main research area is international comparative research in long-term care. This session is one of the 4 sessions related to the theme which aims at an analysis and discussion of the sustainable care at home with a focus of the developing care mix. In this session, we will discuss the role of policies and systems in shaping the care mix in different areas and development in several countries. We will start our presentations with the joint paper of Annie Dussuet and Clémence Ledoux. Annie Dussuet, who will present the paper, is lecturer at the University of Nantes. Her research focuses on home care work from a gender perspective, female employment, or the reconciliation of informal care work and employment. Clémence Ledoux, who will join us for the discussion, is assistant professor at political science at the University of Nantes. Her work concentrates on the dynamics of home care service sector and more regionally on the role employers, organization, and street-level bureaucrats. Now I would like to ask Annie Dussuet to start with her presentation.
Yes, thank you. And first, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference to give my colleague Clémence Ledoux and I the opportunity to present the results of our research. Next slide, please. Our research questions are: how is the care mix, that is to say, division between different types of paid and unpaid services, determined? With what effects on the working and employment conditions on the different categories of care providers? In France, paid services for the elderly are mainly financed by the APA. The APA, for Personalized Allowance for Autonomy, is defined nationally by law, but it is implemented locally by the agents of the different French départements, that is to say, territorial units. These agents apply the national Hygiene grid to define eligibility to the APA. But most importantly, they draw up an help plan which sets the effective level of the allowance according to the various services deemed necessary. So, de facto, this help plan defines the framework for care work, whether paid or unpaid. Next slides, please. Thank you. This paper will be based mainly on a field survey conducted between 2017 and 2019 as part of the PROFAM research program funded by the French National Research Agency in a French département. As research on public policy implementation has shown the importance of street-level bureaucrats, we choose to conduct a qualitative survey at the local level with the agents in charge of the APA applications. So we conducted 35 in-depth interviews, 7 observations of meetings, and we carried out a thematic analysis. Next slide, please. When drawing up the help plan, the agents are faced with a paradoxical double injunction. They must propose a plan that includes paid services while preserving the unpaid commitment of relatives. In addition, They must limit proposals for paid services below a ceiling defined by law. To do this, they adopt a tutelary posture in which they try to delimit the real needs for services from pseudo-needs related to the social class of the applicants. Indeed, some elderly people, while claiming the allowance, don't wish to receive certain services. In this case, the agents proceed gently, initially drawing up a minimalist health plan with only a few hours per week. But other people, on the contrary, demand services that appear unjustified to the agents. For example, many hours of cleanings from people with large dwellings or high housekeeping standards. In this case, the agents use an unofficial rule which defines an hourly package according to the type of needs identified during the home visit. For the agents, the question is avoiding the use of the APA and therefore of public money to meet needs that do not correspond to a loss of capacity but tends to domesticity. So the agents try to reduce the definition of needs to a sub-political level using a biomedical paradigm. But however, they also use a clearly political definition, the search for equality of allocation between the different social classes. Next slide, please. For keeping people at home for as long as possible, the agents consider that the help of relatives is unavoidable and adhere to the national slogan, avoid the exhaustion of family caregivers. The paradox here is that they provide financial support while recognizing that most of the work is done for free by relatives. But taking into account the role of relatives results almost automatically of considering their care work as a given and the health plan only as a complement, and then to reduce benefits when family caregivers are present. However, the national warnings concerning family caregivers' burnout have been heard at this local level. In the name of this concern, some agents allow themselves to intervene in private lives. The cognitive disorders also reinforced their legitimacy to introduce changes in family. In these different cases, most agents act as arbiters of family disagreements in the name of the very viability of home care. In their work of allocating the APA, the agents are subject to multiple, sometimes contradictory constraints. To overcome these contradictions, they rely on nationally or locally defined rules and apply action principle. First, to ensure a sustainable home-based caring. Second, to assure the question of legitimacy of the public spending. And third, they apply an implicit principle of subsidiary which requires to give priority to family solidarity over external intervention. Next slide, please. However, because it provides for services to be carried out, this health plan also constitutes a framework for care work, and we can question the effects of the decisions taken by the agents. Indeed, concerning relatives, there is a general tendency to maintain the statu quo and the division of tasks as long as the situation doesn't appear too unbalanced. As it is allocated to elderly persons with the objective of maintaining them at home, the APA is not intended to replace family members' caregiving, with the exception of the funding of respite schemes. So the work of relatives, especially when it is relational, consisting more of support than of nursing, therefore remains largely invisible, except when it is lacking. In particular, when the family caregivers are the wives, the help provided by external services appears to be a simple adjunct to a situation in which they remain the main caregiver. Despite these ambiguities, the health plan lists paying services that will be at least partially covered by the APA. In theory, APA beneficiaries have a choice regarding the services they wish to have in their home, but in practice, this choice must be made before the notification of the plan. Thus, the agents often play an advisory role. And first, they seek to avoid direct employment for three main reasons. One, the position of employer appears to be too complex for elderly people. Two, they want to avoid the ambiguity of employing one's own child. And third, they seek to maintain control over the quality and effectiveness of the service. But it should be noticed that all these reasons concern the APA beneficiary and the quality of the services. The issue is never considered from the point of view of the potential direct employed worker, nor the quality of the corresponding job. Next slide, please. Paradoxically, this lack of consideration of the conditions of employment and the actual work performed is also found where the work is done by employees of services providers organizations. Thus, the time needed of caring hours per week appears as standardized in hourly packages, and the question of minimal duration of interventions is hardly considered in the development of health plans. Similarly, the frequency of interventions is determined only by the needs of the people being helped. So, the splitting of interventions is imposed by the characteristic of the services described in the health plans, and also by budgetary considerations. Finally, the question of the actual content of the care work and the skills it required is surprisingly absent from the process of drawing up the health plan. It is as if the work to be carried out could be identified solely on the basis of hourly quantification. Thus, more often, the health plans drawn up by the agents, despite or because of their great concern for the quality of the service to be provided to the elderly, lead to bad working and employment conditions for the home-based care workers. Next slide, please. In conclusion, we can say that the reduction of work to an abstract concept that allows it to be measured by time tends to eliminate the less objectifiable tasks with a strong relational dimension. This invisibilization of part of the work has effects on the care mix. Indeed, as the less objectivizable aspects of the work are not provided for in the health plans, they remain assigned to family caregivers or to employees who are less well protected by labor laws or collective agreement. So, next slide, please. Thank you for your attention.
Okay. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation on the development of the care mix within the APA system in France. Now I would like to move to the next paper. The next paper will be presented by Takuro Higuchi. Takuro Higuchi is doctoral student at the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. His research focuses on global issues such as global activist networks, but also on the debate on ethics in care. Now I would like to ask Takuro Higuchi to start with the presentation.
Hello, my name is Takuro Higuchi. I'm a PhD student of Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. My topic today is collision inside care. So today's presentation is composed of 4 sections and a self-introduction. Yeah, please go next. At first, let me introduce myself briefly. I originally researched social movements in Japan. However, I wanted to know the reality, not from the book, but from the real society at the time. I started to practice in the field and established a small enterprise supporting independent living for people with disabilities. There are about 20 users and 50 workers. Recently, we mainly support people with intellectual disabilities, autism, and mental illness. 9 years has already passed. Fortunately, the practical experience deepened my questions. And 2 years ago, I returned to university to write a thesis regarding my questions. This is a brief introduction. So please go next. Yeah, first section is care and violence cohabit. I cite a question posed by Joanne Toronto. She is one of the leading theorists of care. Okay. In the places where we expect to find care, we often find violence, and often violence and care are intertwined. How can violence and care cohabit in intimate space? So this is the basic question of my paper as well. So please go next. Okay, this slide is about the background of the paper. In recent years, background is questioning independence and attention to care. So in recent years, the independent living movement of people with disabilities in Japan has been recognized as reaching a turning point. There are many reasons. Firstly, the movement has accomplished its goals. For example, public policies regarding care have been secured, and advocacy for disability rights is expanding internationally. Secondly, the policy target of independent living was expanded to include people with severe intellectual disabilities and mental illness. Formerly, people considered it's impossible for them to live independently. Now the gate for independent living is open to them. It's clear that contemporary situation is totally different from the independent living in the 70s. Then what does independent mean now? So in such a situation, since around 2000, there has been a conceptual reinterpretation of dependency and a focus on care. This is the situation now. However, I propose that mainstream understandings of care fail to catch some problems. This is the basic background. Can you go next slide? Okay. The blind spot of care. So generally speaking, care and violence are considered as opposite. But is that really so? There are many cases this statement fails. I show two contexts here. First, in some cases, people are excluded on the basis of care. In certain political contexts, screening the other to care or to respond can politically happen. And the second context is there is an imbalance in the distribution of responsibility for caring in many areas in society. In reality, care is surrounded by many different types of violence. In this sense, violence inside a caring relationship is a kind of classical issue, also in some contexts in Japan. So there are some cases. In 1970, a mother killed her disabled daughters. After the murder, there was a campaign calling for mitigation of mother's penalty. This incident triggered the disability rights movement in Japan. And the second case is murders due to caregiver fatigue among older couples. This is quite common in contemporary Japan due to the aging society. Finally, and most tragically, in 2016, 19 people were killed and 26 were injured at a care home for people with disabilities in Sagamihara. The murderer was a former employee of the care facility. The murderer justified his killings on the ground that he said that these people consume public money even though they are completely dependent and unproductive. And he said caregivers have lost hope for the future, something like that. What I want to say here is that we must confront the reality of violence inside care. So please go next. So this is kind of a problem statement. So this paper aims to investigate a mechanism of collisions inside care and a social background that reinforces these collisions. To work on those aims, this paper employs two hypothetical concepts. They are the trade-off in caring relationship and complicity between neoliberalism and support for independence. I show them in the later slides. Okay, the scope is the contemporary situation in Japan after the independent living movement, neoliberal welfare reforms, and the progress of universal deinstitutionalization. And this paper focuses on caring for highly dependent people, those who were formerly institutionalized due to the severity of their disabilities. In other words, this paper focuses on the so-called hard-to-care situation. So please go next. Okay, second section is the trade-off in care. Please go next. Okay, Lewis coined the term welfare trade-off. As he described, demands from welfare user movement can be contrary to demands from the labor movement. Ironically, caring relationship structurally contains collision from the beginning. So this might be an analogy of trade-off. There's a very controversial discussion on induced abortion. You can find a collision between a mother's right to self-determination on her own body and the right to live for an unborn child. Both demands are contrary. Anyway, this paper cannot go deep into this controversial discussion. The point is that caring relationship inevitably contain colliding structure, especially when both agents exist independently. Independent caregiver and independent care recipients, they collide. Okay, can you go next? Okay, so third section is reinforcing the trade-off. Please go next. Okay. So at first we focus on caregivers. Historically, the feminist tradition theoretically supported the sovereignty of people who provide care, such as the Marxist feminism and the feminist political philosophy and so on. Together with the feminist theories, the feminist movement supported caregivers through advocacy and policy proposals. Both feminist theory and the feminist movement put forward the independence of women. Actually, at the time in Japan, there was a viewpoint seeing a major part of progress was women's economic independence. This is a very basic situation for caregivers. How they acquire sovereignty. Okay, please go next. Okay, in such a situation, Nancy Fraser posed an important question, asking, do second wave feminism and neoliberalism share a secret affinity? It's an important question. The Fraser's observation promoted further analysis on the complicity between neoliberalism and second wave feminism, including in Japan. In context of Japan at the time, not all but some feminists required women's economic independence from their husband or the state. They might easily share a secret affinity with the neoliberal policy utilizing women's labor power. This was a situation of caregivers. So please go next. Okay, let us turn to the other side of caring relationship, care recipients. In Japan, people with disability have largely acquired their sovereignty. Disability studies provided important theoretical support for this. In addition to this theoretical progress, advocacy and policy proposals by disability rights movements were also important. And two major legislations were enacted in the early 2000s. These acts secured public welfare services. At the same time, they also established a huge care industry and market. The independence of people with disability was developed a lot through the use of welfare services. Okay, please go next. In such a situation, in the United Kingdom, some researchers started asking questions like, do the independent living movement and neoliberalism share a secret affinity? It's important to ask similar question in the Japanese context. However, there is very little discussion from this viewpoint in Japan. So this paper attempts to ask this question. Let me go. So since 1997, the government started the reform of basic social welfare structure. This is so-called neoliberal welfare reform in Japan. It clearly defined the aim of welfare as to support independence. Also, the policy first manifested notions of user-centered welfare services and self-determination. So this was the reform of Japan. What happened in the late 90s. Significantly, it's important, before the government started welfare reform, one of the leading groups of independent living movement in Japan, the movement group publicized a similar manifest before the government. This manifest contains some concepts that are similar to neoliberal welfare reform. For example, the manifest advocated deregulation to introduce private sector vitality, increasing labor market flexibility and welfare consumerism. So this manifest by the independent living movement overlapped with later neoliberal welfare reforms in some important points. So please go next. Okay. From the 90s to the 2000s, policies of support for independence increased in several spheres in welfare, including policies for homeless and for the poor youth. It means that the independence of women and people with disability simultaneously advanced under neoliberal welfare reform. Symbolic incident was the publication of multi-author work written by a leader of women's movement and independent living movement. So they too published a multi-author work. The book is called Individual Autonomy. The book declared the unity of these two categories of people. However, it is important to ask, what does independence mean for both people who care and people who are cared, especially inside of caring relationship? So one of the consequences is the reinforcement of the trade-off in caring relationship. So please go next. So this is the last part, last section. The collision of sovereignty inside care. So please go next. Reinforced collision. Actually, there is a trade-off relation between the individual autonomy of people with disability and workers' right of care worker. Those two were achievements of so-called minority movement. But ironically, there is a collision between the achievements of both movements. Of course, both movements originally struggled for the right of minorities and their sovereignty. However, in some ways, they result in reinforcing the collision inside caring relationship. In contemporary Japan, what we call the post-independence period, a structural dichotomy has emerged between formerly excluded people with disabilities and care workers who inhabit a lower socioeconomic position. This dichotomy has produced a serious conflict. Sadly, it also means there is a high risk of violence or abuse. Okay, so I would like to finish this paper by posing an open question. Is it possible to escape from the dichotomy between the two? I mean, people who provide care and those who are cared for. Please go next. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for the very interesting paper on the contradictories or blind spot in care and the caring relationships. Now I would like to go to the next paper. The next paper will be presented by Shereen Hussein. Shereen Hussein is Professor of Health and Social Care Policy at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in London. Her research focused primarily on the UK health and care policies and service delivery, organisation and outcomes, but with comparative elements across Europe and the world. We'll see it now. She is a co-investigator of this research program, Sustainable Care, Connecting People and Systems, and she's leading the work package Migrant Care Workers in the UK. Please, Shereen, start with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Hildegard, for this introduction, and thank you for having me today. So today, as Hildegard has said, I am going to speak about some research from the Sustainable Care Programme, specifically looking at the experience of some of our international partners and international kind of comparative countries as some learning lessons for the current dynamic immigration landscape in the UK, association specifically with post-Brexit immigration system. So just to say that this presentation is a collaboration with my colleagues, Dr. Agnes Turnpenny at the University of Kent, who works with me on the sustainable care research program, and Professor Sara Charlesworth at the RMIT in Melbourne. And in this paper, we specifically looking to map experience looking at migration regimes and the use of migrant workers, whether specifically to be home care workers or ending up being home care workers in Canada, Australia, and the UK, and sitting some of these comparative work within a context of primary data collected through the work package here in the UK through 2 rounds of Delphi surveys, looking at the views and experience of a set of expert panel in the UK, with the aim primarily to inform the current debates around potential UK post-Brexit immigration system. Next, please. So just to start by providing some background, so we are well aware that migrant care workers make a significant contribution in most countries, and not only high-income countries, but also including low and middle-income countries in relation to care, whether provided at home or in formal settings. And there is a lot of writing around global care chains where, that creates gaps, and that creates, while they are filling, care gaps in some countries, they're creating other gaps in their home countries. And this is created because of care deficits, which is that the rapid increase in the need for care across the globe, and whether because some of the countries are going through population aging and thus they do not have enough working age groups, or because care is not a formalized job, and as we have seen from the previous presentations and from different kind of demographic changes, the informal caregivers, usually women, are now more, employed in the labor market. There is migration, whether internal or international, and that there are gaps in who could provide care, and the arrangements varies, whether it is through domestic work as a package of something else or is specific for care work. However, of course, the share composition, role and profile of migrant workers who contribute to this sector specifically can differ across political, legal, and welfare regimes, and also in their experience, although that some of their characteristics remain similar. For example, the majority of them are women within certain background and certain age groups. However, their experience and the impact of their work on them and on the people that they provide care differ, and is shaped by primarily by three high kind of macro level structures. These are the care regimes or welfare regimes, the migration systems and employment system, as well as what we call now migrant agency, or the role of the individual person to make decisions. Next, please. So if we want to do some comparative research across different countries, there are usually a lot of difficulties, but there are some specific to migrant care workers. To start with, the term care worker is quite fluid and context specific. Who do you call a care worker? So not only in general, but even more specifically in writing and in policy documents and in referencing. There are, as I said, alluded to, in some countries, care comes under a broader umbrella of domestic help, or more specifically under health care or social care. Once we move from definitions, then the availability of data and care workforce registration and data collection quite varied. And even in high-income countries like England, for example, we don't have a register of the care workforce. We have some increasingly big data to draw from. However, there is no a complete register. In addition to, when we come to identify who is the migrant, again, we can think about whether they have become a migrant through settlement and citizenship neutralization, or they have just arrived recently, and thus the settlement and nationality rules vary across different settings, and impact of we can count as a kind of a homeborn or someone who become a citizen, in addition to obtaining the data about this. Another point is the size of the grey economy. So there is a lot of, for example, in some countries, there is considerable numbers of undocumented migrants who actually contribute to the care spheres, and thus they're in many cases very difficult to capture. Next, please. So to start with features of care regimes, one of the key things that we can look at in terms of shaping the recruitment of migrant workers is the formal qualification threshold to allow people to enter the country and to allow people to join the sector. And then the attractiveness of this sector to the residents' workforce, whether they are nationals of the host country or migrants already existing within the society. And that brings in a whole range of conditions like pay and job quality, but also the status of the care work and the value the society places on them. And we've seen in many countries, and we've heard other speakers in different sessions in this conference talking about marketization process, personalization process, and how that created new systems of payments like cash for care, new markets, private markets that could attract a range of different groups of people for different reasons. And also the familiar systems and how support can be assumed or exists really, and the fragmentation of this. And within these whole kind of dynamics, there is always a risk of exploitation, labor exploitation, particularly when it comes to migrants, but notwithstanding that some of the other workers who are homegrown workers can be subject to these risks of exploitation. And also when the family is available, there is the opportunity cost of informal caring. What sort of sacrifice they have to make to continue the provision of care. As well as, of course, as we mentioned briefly, is the societal preferences and discourse around caring and competence care. Next, please. So if we think about the features of migration regimes that could facilitate or hinder, so of course, social care is presented as a low paid, regarded as low skilled, which is not true, but this is informally, does not require a certain high level of qualification and usually falls within the level of under the threshold if you want to hire skilled migrants, for example. So visa-free access is really important to consider, and what are the conditions of temporary particular conditions and work visa arrangements. Who do they exclude or include? And also in some countries we see some regularization programs for already existing migrants or workers who are undocumented, and that could facilitate attracting some of those to the sector. And another factor when migrant workers make decisions is access to long-term settlement and neutralization, which is quite different across countries. And for example, in some of our countries, we're going to see that we compared that, a lot of people would come doing something else, but they end up doing care work. Next, please. So maybe have this slide as big. So there are demographic contexts that we are all operating in. And of course, there is the population aging. And the three countries we're looking at, you can see that the United Kingdom is one of the older populations compared to Canada and Australia. And of course, we know that Canada and Australia in general, younger population because they relied on settled migrants who came at a young age group, and they are kind of countries, destination countries for many young people. So they are in general younger. But then also that is reflected, of course, in the long-term care recipients. And I have to caution here around these figures, because some of these are quite old figures, particularly in the UK. We are still relying on 2004 estimates. And here we are presenting perhaps a percentage of people in receipt of long-term care services as a percentage of the 65 plus population in the 3 countries, and whether that at home or in an institution. And you see that, for example, in an institution is a bit higher in Australia comparatively. For example, Canada, the majority receives care at home, and we are quite specifically interested in care at home because this is where perhaps a lot of the overlap between formal and informal issues arise, and some consideration of labor exploitation and protection of workers' rights. Next, please. So again, if we look at the patterns of migration, so just I alluded to that, the UK has a history of immigration from the Commonwealth, particularly in the 70s and 60s, and they were actually driven specifically to certain low-paid jobs, and then, of course, since 2004, there have been the free movement of labor within the European Union. However, this is changing this year. While in contrast, Australia and Canada have a long history of permanent migration and settlement, and relatively more recently around skilled-based immigration systems, so attracting high skills. And that is really kind of reflected in the percentage of the foreign-born population within the 3 countries. So you've got Australia has a quite high percentage of people who are foreign-born compared to the United Kingdom, and Canada is somewhere in the middle. Next, please. So if we focus on the experience of Australia, and specifically looking at care workers, we find that there is no front doors pathways to care until recently. So there is some changes, but in the majority of cases, people migrate to Australia, perhaps accompanying other family members or coming as students, and then end up working in care rather than coming to a specific program of migration. The care work is classified as low skilled, and current migrant care workers come on a mix of temporary, whether students or working holidays, and very small on skilled visas. So there is a new kind of a program called Pacific Labour Scheme, and it has a specific focus on attracting care workers from the neighbouring Pacific Islands, and the uptake here is very, very small. So, however, we see that there is a large and increasing proportion of migrants overseas born in direct care work. And for example, the 2016 census data indicate increasing migration of those working aged care from non-main English speaking background. 42% of all personal care assistants and 27% of all aged and disabled carers. And they come mainly from regions like South Asia, mainly from India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bangladesh. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the temporary or specific work visa program. There are three employer-sponsored pathway for migrant care workers in Australia. So individual company specific labour migration agreement between the government and specific employer, designated area labour migration agreement in Northern Australia, which is called kind of Northern Territory, and the Pacific Labour Scheme, which is alluded at. At the time being, there is not much data on the first two, in the uptake of the two first schemes, and the third scheme has had minimal uptake by care workers, which we have to say does not allow any access to settlement, which is something quite important to consider. Next, please. So focusing on Canada, currently about 1 in 3 care workers are foreign-born in Canada. It has actually quite a long tradition of care-specific migration pathways with settlement that really focused on live-in caregiving, and if we remember, we've seen that they have a lot of proportionally more in-home care provision. So they had the 1981 Foreign Domestic Workers Program, and then in 1992 the Live-in Caregivers Program. However, the latter program has closed in 2014, and care work is introduced and incorporated into the federal temporary foreign worker program, which has had now two elements of low wage and high wage. And within Canada, there is various provincial programs because it depends on the provinces. Within different provinces, they have their own kind of programs to support these. There is something called the Labour Market Impact Assessment, which has been increased for low kind of skilled or low wages, and it demonstrates for the employer, they have to demonstrate that they try to recruit from at least two underrepresented groups within Canada, and how long this permit is valid vary in length, and I think from 2014 they decided that it's going to be only valid for 1 year for all low wage kind of workers. Next, please. So if we look at the immigration plans for care workers, I've been given that I've got 2 minutes left, so I will swiftly go through these. So maybe we can move to the next one, so we can have some the experience and the challenges. So there is favorable labour market outcomes of both care workers and accompanying family members in Canada in comparison to other countries we looked at. However, there are some reports of experiencing working conditions, low working conditions and exploitation. And there is also some occupation stigma. Next, please. So in the United Kingdom, we have 17% of the social care workforce is non-British. And the share of non-British nationals are relatively stable. But as we talk through that, there has been a lot of changes in immigration policy, particularly around the European Union. And you can see this is reflected straight away in the composition of the care workforce in England. So we see that the share of non-EU migrant has been reduced, while the share of EU migrants has been increased since the expansion of the EU in 2004 and particularly 2010. However, of course, with Brexit, this, of course, is going to reflect on the other direction. Next, please. So the new proposed UK post-Brexit immigration system is based on similar kind of Australian points-based. The free movement of the EU nationals ended on the 31st of December 2020 last year. However, there have been an EU settlement scheme for EU nationals that has been uptaken quite rapidly. So I think around 5 million EU nationals have gone through this settlement scheme. And there will be a new immigration system. This new immigration system has been introduced and based on skills and point-based, as well as employer sponsorship. Until very recently, senior care workers were not put in the shortage list, but there has been added. And basically, it will become very difficult to obtain a visa for non-EU nationals, for either non-EU or EU nationals, but it will allow now a little bit more of non-EU nationals, but it's quite costly and restrictive. And social care workers are below the qualification threshold and the payment threshold, the annual salary, because the threshold requests around 21,000 annual income, which is higher than the average of care workers in the UK. Next, please. Just to tell you a little bit quickly about our Delphi survey. So it's an expert survey. We had 2 rounds, one in 2019 and one in last year in 2020. Both happened at a time of huge uncertainties around Brexit, but then last year, of course, the pandemic. And all the experts, there was an agreement that there will be decline in work migration after Brexit, which will impact the sector negatively. It's also, there was a consensus that migrant care workers are important, but the there is a consensus to the need to make the sector more attractive to the residents' workforce, which seen by them as unlikely because it will necessitate increasing pay and improving working conditions, which will necessitate increasing funding in social care. And there were certain areas and groups whose service use are expected to be more affected. Particularly, there are gaps emerging, particularly when migrants were concentrated, like dementia care, people with physical disability. And there has been the two surveys, the expert groups, shown some support for creating sectoral visa. However, they also were aware that this may, create potential problems. Next, please. Just to finish up with lessons. So from the two countries that we looked at, Canada and Australia, low-wage work visa programs pose particular challenges for implementation, and it's not 100% proof as a solution. And there is also a well-known link between restrictiveness and exploitation of migrant workers. So they are on the front line for exploitative labor practice. There is also this idea of temporariness and a trapdoor of permanent temporariness because of inability to become a resident, or the conditions of the work permit or the visa is temporary and you have to reapply and reapply. You don't have a route to settle and then kind of have a permanent position where you are. There is also sectoral and geographical visa programs, and it depends on different, kind of places and context and the welfare regimes that we operate on. And the other thing that is, of course, happened is the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. And it's quite pronounced in some European countries where they're reliant to a large extent on circular migrants within Europe. And how is that going to be mitigated? And how is it going to impact on the UK? And what are the sort of lessons we can take from there? So next slide, please. Just to acknowledge and thank you very much for listening. And I look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shereen, for your interesting presentation on the role or involvement of migrant care workers and the role of the policies around. Now we move to our last paper. The paper is of Sara Era. Sara Era is doctoral researcher at the University of Jyväskylä. She's working at the Center of Excellence in Research and Aging and Care. Her research interests are in the intersection of disability and old age, equality issues, and ageism. Please start with your presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Hildegard, for introducing me, and thank you for the organizers of having me in this session to share my thoughts of my research. So today I'm talking about, this is the first article of my dissertation research, that is negotiating disability, and where I'm looking at the disability and old age in the disability legislation reform in Finland. Next slide, please. So a bit of the background of why this is important. It's that previous research has shown that age-related disabilities are not necessarily seen as actual disabilities, but rather something that just happens with age. And therefore, older persons with disabilities tend to be excluded from disability discourses and policies and activism. The UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities does not make any distinction between age-related disabilities and other disabilities, but rather acknowledges intersectional discrimination, that a person can be discriminated against by disability and age. So, however, many national service systems have age-related restrictions in disability services. For example, Sweden, Finland, Ireland has some kind of age-related restrictions. So the question here is that, is it ageism or a necessary separation of older person services and disability services. So can it be considered unequal or equal? Next slide, please. So the context is Finnish disability services and aging in it. So in Finnish disability services, there is no specific age-related restriction in disabilities in general, according to legislation. But however, in personal assistance, there is a slight restriction that says that persons with severe disabilities are eligible if their disabilities are not mainly caused by deterioration due to old age. So even though in legislation there is no age-related restrictions other than in personal assistance, in practice many older persons with disabilities are directed to older persons services instead, and that can lead to older persons with disabilities being in worse positions since older persons services have less services with less secured rights. Next slide, please. So the main objective of the disability legislation reform in Finland, that is at the moment it's ongoing, but the main objective is to merge two pieces of legislation that together make the disability services. So the Act on Intellectual Disabilities and the Disability Services Act are to be merged into the renewed Disability Services Act. And in addition to merging these two, some revisions are being made in the contents and, for example, in the coverage of the Act, in which I am interested in. Next slide, please. So the period of interest in this article is from the 2017 to 2018. In 2017, there was this draft proposal that included an age-related restriction to the Act, and public statements were given to it, and these statements are what I am analyzing. And after that, in 2018, a government proposal was given. Next slide, please. So the suggested age-related restriction in the proposal in 2017 was almost the same as the one in personal assistance now. So the restriction was that the Act would not be applied to a person whose assistance and support needs mainly result from conditions that have originated, worsened, or increased because of old age or from deterioration due to old age. So this was the suggested age-related restriction that then got statements. Next slide, please. Yes, so my research question for this article was, how is the principle of equality used in justifying arguments for and against the proposed age-related restriction, and what kind of conceptualizations of old age and disability do these arguments embody? So I was interested in the equality and also the conceptualizations of old age and disability. Next slide, please. So the data is altogether 162 publicly given statements, from which 98 were relevant to my research. I included only the ones discussing the age-related restriction. And in the analysis, I used Boltanski and Thevenot's justification theory and problem-driven content analysis with a focus on equality. And I categorized my data by equity norms. since I found that the commenters view the fairness under a bit different terms. So these equity norms are kind of the standards of entitlement by which a policy can be assessed. So for example, do some needs get same shares? Or for example, same money invested get the same shares? Or what is the norm by which equality is assessed? So I found 3 different categories that were equity of equal normality, equity of equal needs, and equity of equal disadvantages. So next slide, please. So the first one was equity of equal normality. So in this category, fairness was assessed by what is and what is not normal aging. Since age-related disabilities were suggested to be excluded, many wanted to distance themselves from normal aging. Like the Finnish Federation of the Visually Impaired said that the Finnish Federation of the Visually Impaired highlights that acquiring visual impairments is not normal aging. There's always a disease behind the visual impairment that has caused it. It is not normal, ordinary frailty of old age or the usual deteriorating health in old age. Next slide, please. So then the next category was equity of equal needs. And in this category, needs are in the focus. And for example, this commenter opposes the restriction by claiming that we think it is discrimination that age affects whether or not one gets disability services. So the age restriction should not be implemented. We think that the Act should apply to every person who needs necessary and frequent help or support in their daily life due to a functional limitation caused by a long-lasting impairment or disease. Next slide, please. So the last category was equity of equal disadvantages. This category was the smallest one, but still visible. Here, the arguments look at who are disadvantaged. For example, the Finnish Association of People with Physical Disabilities claim that the precondition for subjective rights, both socioeconomically and individually, is that it is not a universal service and that the services are intended to target a relatively small group of the socially most disadvantaged persons that are in need of special solutions. So this was a supporting argument for the restriction. But for the opponents, on the other hand, they found that especially older persons with disabilities are in a disadvantaged position. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I was wondering that based on my analysis, it seems that the understanding of equality varies according to how disability itself is understood, and whether or not age-related disabilities are included in disabilities. And here a challenge is that how to draft equality increasing disability services if there is no consensus of what equality means in this case. So I suggest that it is useful to recognize different understandings of equality and disability and different equity norms by which the policy is assessed. Next slide, please. And maybe next slide still, so we can see the references. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Sara, for an interesting presentation and analysis of the policies from an equality perspective. Now we'll come to the discussant, Teppo Kröger, who will give his comments to all papers in once, and after this we have time for discussion. Teppo Kröger is Professor of Social and Public Policy and Head of the Center of Excellence in Research on Aging Care at the University of Uvescula. In his research, he analyzes social care systems from local, comparative, and global perspectives, and he has framed or crafted a lot of different concepts in the area. Now I would like Teppo Kröger to start.
Thank you very much, Hildegard, and thanks to all the presentators. We just heard 4, I think, very interesting papers and presentations coming from 4 different national contexts, and that are really discussing the area of care and also disability in quite broad sense and from different perspectives. Now, my plan is to just pose some questions that I've been kind of left thinking after these presentations. I think that we already learned a lot, but there are still some issues that I'm wondering in my mind, and maybe in the discussion that is soon going to start, we can hear a bit more from each paper and each the findings and the backgrounds of each of these studies. So to start with the first study from France by Dussuet and Clémence Ledoux. Thank you for a very interesting study. I think this is probably the first qualitative study that I've seen or heard about how the APA is implemented in the grassroots level. Well, I guess there must be a lot of this research in France, but unfortunately I haven't really been able to read it at least or hear it at least in English, and it's really interesting. Now we are seeing what is really happening when policies are put into practice. And there's really a lot of things are going on. But just to start with, I think that for a foreign reader, we might still need a bit of more background information about the APA in order to understand the kind of the framework and the context of what is going on here. For example, the eligibility criteria. You tell in the presentation and in the paper that there are these different GIR levels that assess the level of dependency or the level of needs, but it's still kind of unclear that what comes out of these GIR levels. So what does a person have a right to when she is assessed to be on the GIR level 1 versus GIR level 4, for example? Do they have? I would guess that they have different rights, different benefits that they can have from that. And also, what needs are covered? Are all different kinds of needs covered by APA? For example, you mentioned that household tasks like cleaning seem to be covered. Which is very interesting because now they have been excluded from many systems, including in my country. The home care doesn't really provide household tasks, practical care anymore. It focuses on this personal care, bodily care. So this is also interesting in a comparative sense to see where the responsibilities are defined and how that line is drawn. And how does APA go into practice if a person is kind of given 3 hours of cleaning for a week? How does she get the service? As it's an allowance, I guess that there are these non-profit and maybe for-profit providers that are used, but how does that go forward, that process? And then in the end, is the older person the employer or customer of this organization? So how does the money also move? And does the APA cover the whole cost, for example, for these 3 hours of cleaning, or only part of that when there will be a user fee, a part of the cost to be paid by the older person? And is that related to income levels or not? So there are these kind of background questions that would still make it much easier for a foreign reader to understand the context and what is going on, and what can the older persons expect from this system. There are many topics in your paper. I'm not sure whether this is kind of a summary of a larger report, or is this meant for a single article in a journal. I would say that it works better as a summary, because there are so many different issues included. There are this issue that how needs are defined, what needs are covered, how the level of support is defined. And then there's the issue of family carers, what kind of support is provided, which family carers are defined as worthy of the support, and what level of support, how is that constructed in these negotiations. And then there's also the issue of care workers, former care workers that you take up, and you particularly see that their working conditions are not really taken into account. That is interesting issue, but I also don't really understand how they could or should be taken into account if the department is not the employer of these care workers, or how do you think that could be organized, that kind of support for care workers? And then finally, the role of older people. Actually, that is an issue that is not so much present in your paper. Maybe it's not your topic in this analysis. Maybe you analyze it somewhere else. But I'm still left wondering that what is the role of older people in the whole process? They remain quite invisible in your presentation, and I also wonder whether this reflects the system that they don't get much voice in the negotiation about the definition and assessment, and how APA is used, and what levels are given. So I wonder whether what is really the role of older people, or are they largely ignored in the process? This is something that I'm really left wondering. Well, there are a lot of questions. Maybe you don't have time to answer all questions, but I just mentioned that this is really a very interesting qualitative study of the grassroots bureaucracy, or the street bureaucracy, street level bureaucracy, what is taking place in this very interesting processes when APA is used and defined. Well, I think it's time to go forward. Thank you also Takuro Higuchi for a very interesting paper on Japan and the independent living. Very, very interesting discussions. For example, this trade-off between older or disabled people and care workers. That's an interesting approach. You speak about the dichotomy. I might add that actually I would see that as a trichotomy, because there's also, you are speaking about care workers, and then you are speaking about care users or care receivers, but then there's also a third group of family carers that are very much involved in this process. So actually there might be at least 3 different kinds of interests that might be in conflict with each other, not just two sides having a trade-off. So at least there could be 3 different kinds of trade-offs and tensions. Well, of course, one study doesn't need to include all the possible approaches, but at least I think that's good to take into account. Well, I was left kind of yearning for more information about the independent living movement and also independent living policies in Japan. You tell something about that, and I know otherwise that the independent living movement has been really in Japan has really been a pioneer in the Asian context and also influenced many other countries in that area. So it would be really interesting to hear more details, also how it has progressed over time, and then what policies have come out. So now it's not really clear that what kind of support is available for disabled people in Japan based on the ideas of independent living. For example, are there personal assistants that these people can use? And also, what is the relationship between these independent living policies and more traditional care policies, like the long-term care insurance that you mentioned in your presentation? So, for example, what is the relation between independent living and home care? In many countries, many disabled activists do not really like home care or prefer it and see it as carrying these professional problematic intentions and ideologies that don't fit together with independent living thinking. But what do you think about that, and how do you see the Japanese situation in that respect? And well, you leave it in the air that is it possible to escape the dichotomy or actually a trichotomy between these groups? I must say that question reminds very much the question that I posed in one paper where I looked at care research and disability studies and posed the question, nothing in common. I would also be very interested to hear your answer to your own question. Is it possible to escape these different maybe trade-off and conflictual approaches? So moving to Shereen Hussein's presentation, thank you very much for a very interesting 3-country study on migrant care workers. We know that migrant care workers are present in almost every care regime around the world, and their importance is growing. And it's very interesting to have 3 countries covered in one single study: the UK, Australia, and Canada. And there was a lot of information, interesting stuff in your presentation. But I was kind of looking forward for your comparative conclusions. So how do these three systems, these 3 countries, in the end compare with each other when we look at migrant care workers and their conditions for to enter the country and to work in formal care, in home care and residential care, and did you also, by the way, want to cover migrant care workers working in outside the formal care sector as the live-in care staff or not? That was not fully clear to me, because we know that this is really excuse me, very important in many countries around the world, these live-in migrant care workers. So in the end, what is the role of migrant care workers in these 3 different countries? What are their shares of the staff? How are their conditions in the 3 different countries compared to each other? For example, is one of these 3 countries more migrant care friendly than the others? Maybe you could give some answer to that we are left wondering. And finally, actually, your abstract doesn't include 3 countries but 6 countries. It also includes 3 Asian countries: Taiwan, Japan, and Singapore. And I fully understand that it's really difficult to include 6 countries in one single paper. But maybe you could say a few words also about what were your plans to also, why did you want to in the beginning to include also these Asian countries, and are you still planning to study for them, and what are you expecting to find when you're comparing the Asian countries with these English-speaking countries? And finally, Sala Era and her paper on this gray zone between disability and old age, and these processes, policy-making processes, negotiations, definitions that are taking place in this gray zone. That is also a very, very interesting paper. Well, that I happen to know also otherwise, as we are working in the same center with Sala. But it's particularly interesting, really, your findings that these 2 different sides, those who are for the age-related restrictions and those who are against them, are really using kind of the same arguments, or at least the same concepts, the same approaches in their statements. And I was wondering, what do you think, Sala, that are all of these statements really serious about what they say, for example, using equality, or are some kind of just paying lip service or using these strategic keywords that they think that maybe have an influence on policymakers? When you mention equality, particularly in the Nordic welfare context, maybe that's policymakers, that rings a bell for the policymakers. So anyway, do you think the people are really serious when they are all using these concepts? And overall, what do you think when about the situation that these kind of opposite sides are using the same concepts in arguing for their interests? And what are its outcomes? Does it mean that actually these concepts lose their importance and meaning if they can be used for arguing this and that, or anything in between? So does this change our approach to these concepts like equality? And finally, I think this is also a key question here, that when the arguments are opposite, even when they use the same concepts, so do you think that these parties are so far away from each other that there's no possibility for dialogue or for building a shared understanding on these issues? Is there any way to find common ground or some kind of compromises, or is it just that it's these statements that are for and those that are against are just from different worlds, and there cannot be a bridge between them? What do you think of this issue? And finally, do you have anything that you would like to say, that how do you feel that this discussion is relevant for other countries, and what is there anything that other countries or researchers in other countries can learn from this debate that is going on and has been going on for a long time in Finland? So what can other countries learn from that? A lot of questions. I would have even some more, but I think that is already enough from me. So I give the word back to our chair, Hildegard. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for interesting questions and comments. Now we have not so much time left for the discussion. We cannot discuss all questions and comments, of course. So I would like to ask the speakers for every paper to use 2 to 3 minutes to answer comments or questions and to react to your comments. You can, of course, select what is important for you. I would say you can start directly. I don't want to wrap it up because we have so lack of time. I think I would like to ask Shereen at first because she has to leave. Is it right for you? Just 2-3 minutes that they have in night.
No, well, thank you very much, Hildegard and Teppo, for the questions. So, well, basically, I would love to answer your questions. However, it's very difficult to establish who's a migrant and who has born outside of the country and now is counted. And that brings back to the definition. So you find a very high proportion of foreign-born workers in both Canada and Australia. So, for example, nearly half of the Australian workforce that is focused on aged care or the caring for disability are foreign-born. And you find around thirds in Canada, while the figure is in the UK, because we use nationality rather than foreign-born, stands around between 17% to 20%. So it's very difficult to establish. However, looking at the immigration routes, because one of the key questions, how people enter the country and whether they will be able to permanently settle, and then if they can become citizens. So if you look at the routes for attracting migrant workers, you find that the Canadian system has allowed this in a more decent way, I would say, in terms of programs of employment and working conditions, particularly on acknowledging the live-in care workers, which is something you're absolutely right about to highlight, that there is a lot working in home care. And it is something that I wanted to capture. But again, the data doesn't allow this. It allows it to a certain degree. However, even Canada is different between provinces, and also they have changed the scheme in 2014 to amalgamate low-skilled, low-wage workers within the larger temporary work visa. So this is yet to be seen. On the other hand, Australia has always relied on people just coming into Australia and with no specific route. So the new specific route that is for the Pacific Island, that is something specific to the Northern Territory, basically in Australia, where it's an area not usually attractive for people to go to. And the uptake of that specific scheme is very low, and it doesn't allow itself or lend itself for settlement. On the other hand, the UK relied largely over the last nearly 2 decades on the free mobility within EU and on attracting on work permits nurses from the Philippines and from India prior to abolishing the system. So it's really difficult to say, actually, and this is why we started with 7. I report on a more number of countries in a forthcoming book chapter, but it becomes very difficult then to try to draw commonalities. I think the one commonalities, I would say that there is a convergence, although there are lots of differences, immigration systems, welfare system, there is a convergence on the increased importance of migrant care workers. Nobody could deny this in whatever context, in whatever country, as well as an increased risk of exploitation because of these fragmented systems and pathways to recruitment. So I would stop here, but I would love to take this conversation further if we have time.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would like to move to the first paper, and I would like to ask Clémence Ledoux to give a short comment.
Yes, thank you very much, Teppo. It's very helpful to hear how this first version can be read by a foreign colleague. So we have an inductive approach, so that's why you have seen we have still difficulties to select to what point we should concentrate, but you are totally true. We should really reduce our arguments, and thank you very much for your feedback. And it's also very helpful to see that we should probably give more elements on the national frames, but it's difficult because we have the national frames and then the departments, so the local authorities have also a room of maneuver, and then our arguments, it's on the street level bureaucrats, so it's another level. And of course, so I can give you some elements if you want about the national frame. So this GIR, so these different levels, at the national level, the French state indicates the maximum money that people can get at home when they have the health plan. But then it's the department who are in charge, and these street level bureaucrats who are in charge to evaluate the needs. And of course, they can give much more less than the average, which is defined at the national level. And of course, our local authorities in France had many difficulties after the crisis, and they try to reduce also the amount of money dedicated, and that's why we also explain how the department where we did this research, for example, tried to introduce some standards for the GIR4, so giving an amount of domestic work hours, and when people have to eat or when the toilets has washing, when people need to be washed, how many hours it should be, but still the street level have the possibilities to go beyond the standard. But then our question was how do they do this? And yes, it's but we are concerning the money. It's when so people are free during the negotiation of the plans to choose if they want a service or if they want direct employment. So if they choose services, it means provider organizations. Then the workers will be employed by the provider organization. And then in this department, the department directly pays the providers organization. And
Excuse me, you have to move. Excuse me, you have to move.
But thank you very much.
To answer some part of the questions. Excuse me, it's very interesting. I think it would have a very interesting debate based on your comments. But now I would like to go to Takuro Higuchi. Please select one issue you would like to answer.
Thank you very much for your comment. Let me reply. You made me many comments anyway. So, you asked me in my presentation, the emergence and development of independent living movement in Japan is not included. Maybe you want to know how is the independent living movement in Japan, or how is the policy was made. It's also, of course, very important. But my presentation, my paper, focus on the different situation. I mean, the progress and the emergence of independent living movement was in 70s. So I want to focus on the post-independent living movement. Yeah, it's about 2010s. So it's out of focus. I'm sorry very much, but thank you very much for your comment. Of course, in my paper, I will add a lot of description of the policies and how they achieve. For example, we have personal assistance for supporting independent living in Japan. So, for example, I am a practitioner. For example, last night I worked for, supporting people with disabilities as a night shift as a personal assistant. Anyway, and okay. So your last question, you made me question like how to escape dichotomy. Do you have answer or something like that? And my answer is this is a very conceptual answer, so it's not a practical. Sorry, but for example, feminist movement tried to develop sovereignty of people who provide care, and disability rights movement tried to develop the sovereignty of people who receive care. So I think we need to develop the sovereignty of care. This is one of the conceptual answers. It's very vague, so that's okay.
Thank you very much. I would like now to give the last chance to Sara Eller to answer direct to the comments or answer a question.
Yes, thanks very much, Teppo, for your questions. I would like to answer all of this and discuss this more, but the first question, are all serious about equality? Well, might not be, because these were publicly given statements. So these are what they wanted to say in public. And there's some evidence from other studies that there might be some fears of like dividing resources. If there would be more people coming into disability services, then the people already using disability services might have to divide the resources with some other people as well. So they might fear for worsening services or lesser services or more low quality services, because there would be more people sharing the same resources. But this was not voiced in these statements, but this might be something that people are thinking about, at least from other studies. This has been the case. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank all speakers for the very interesting presentations and the very interesting comments and discussions on the comments. I think it was a very good session. It really showed the complexity of policies in the role of shaping the care mix. So you showed the problems of policy designs, underlying values, you showed implementations and the problems, the role of all of regimes and how they impact on it. And I think it became very clear that it's a complex issue, but a very interesting issue. So I would like to say thank you to you, and I would like to finalize this session. Thank you.